At 5 o'clock in the morning on June 22, 1842, a small crew opened a gate on the Croton River, about 40 miles north of New York City, and let the river in. The water slid into a brick tunnel barely wide enough to stand in and started walking downhill toward Manhattan at a little under 2 miles an hour. It did not stop. It crossed valleys on stone arches. It slipped through hills that had been blasted open by hand, and 22 hours later it reached the Harlem River at the top of the island. There was no pump anywhere on the line, and no engine of any kind. The entire thing ran on gravity, on a drop of 13 inches for every mile, which is about the thickness of a single brick, and it held that grade dead steady for 41 miles. It had all been dug by pick, shovel, and black powder, under a self-taught engineer named John B. Jervis. Jervis had learned his trade with an axe in his hands on the Erie Canal, and he set that grade himself. One of his assistant engineers, a young man named Fayette Bartholomew Tower, walked the whole job and later wrote it all down in a book, so we are not guessing at how this was done. We have the record. And here is the part that still gets me. The largest city in the country, then and now, was rescued by a hand-dug masonry ditch that hardly anyone who lives there has ever heard of. It is called the Old Croton Aqueduct, and I want to walk the whole line with you, because the numbers in the record do not lie, and they are better than the legend. To understand why grown men wept in the street when that water finally came, you have to understand what New York was drinking before it. The island of Manhattan sits in salt water, and its own groundwater was shallow, brackish, and by the 1830s, foul. The city had grown to 250,000 people who were still pulling their water from backyard wells and street pumps. For 40 years, the city had leaned on a single private company, the Manhattan Company, chartered back in 1799, with a promise to bring in clean water. It never really did. Rather than pipe fresh water down from the Bronx River as it might have, the company sank its wells into the Collect Pond, a shallow downtown pond that generations of tanneries and slaughterhouses had already fouled, because that was cheaper. It laid only about 23 miles of wooden pipe under the streets, and it charged around $20 a year for the service, which put it out of reach of most working families. So the wealthy paid cartmen to haul cleaner water in by the barrel, and everyone else drank what was there, out of the wells and the pumps, next to the privies. A city of 250,000 people was still getting its water the way a frontier village did. Then, in the summer of 1832, cholera came. It moved through the wells and the cesspools and the crowded wards, and by the time it burned out, 3,515 New Yorkers were dead, out of a population near 250,000. People who could afford to leave the city left. The ones who stayed learned, the hard way, that a city cannot drink its own waste and live. If the sickness was not enough, the fire was. On the night of December 16, 1835, a blaze broke out in the warehouse district, in the coldest part of a brutal winter. It was so cold that the East River had frozen, and the harbor was choked with ice. When the firefighters ran out their engines and opened the hydrants, the water froze in the hoses. A reporter for the Evening Post wrote that the hoses of many of the engines were frozen and useless. With no working water, the men gave up trying to put the fire out and started blowing up buildings with gunpowder to starve it of fuel. By morning, something close to 700 buildings were gone, and 17 city blocks in the heart of Lower Manhattan had been leveled. The richest commercial district in America had burned down because there was nothing to throw on it. So the city stopped arguing. 2 years after the cholera, the voters had already approved the idea of bringing in an outside water supply, and the target was set well to the north, on the Croton River in Westchester County. The plan was almost absurd in its simplicity. Dam the Croton, catch the river in a reservoir, and then carry that water 41 miles south, downhill the entire way, in a covered stone channel, until it arrived in Manhattan high enough to feed the streets. There would be no steam and no pumping works anywhere in it, only a very long and very precise slope, doing all the labor. The first engineer to survey that line was a West Point man named David Bates Douglas, and he did the early field work, walked the route, and drew the first plans. But Douglas was slow and the commissioners lost patience, and in 1836 they replaced him with Jervis. That decision is easy to skip past, and I do not want to, because Jervis is the whole story. He was born in 1795 and raised on a farm in Rome, New York, and he had almost no formal schooling in engineering, because in America at that time, there was almost none to be had. What there was instead was the Erie Canal. In 1817, at 22 years old, Jervis hired onto that canal as an axeman, clearing brush and trees ahead of the diggers, under the chief engineer Benjamin Wright. He paid attention. He moved up to rodman, sighting the levels, then resident engineer, laying out the line himself, and by the time the canal was done, he was running an entire division of it. Almost every American civil engineer of that generation came up the same way, on that same canal, because there was no university in the country then that could teach them what a shovel and a level and a few hundred miles of ditch could. The Erie Canal was the school, and Jervis had graduated near the top of it. When the Croton commissioners needed a man who could hold a precise grade across mile after mile of rough country with nothing but hand tools, he was one of the very few in America who had actually done it. Now the commissioners handed him the hardest water problem in America and told him to solve it with hand tools. Let me walk through what that actually required. It began at the river. Up in the Westchester Hills, the crews threw a masonry dam across the Croton to pond the water back into a long reservoir, and at the head of the line they built a stone gatehouse where the water entered the aqueduct proper. From there the whole line was broken into sections, and each section was put under a resident engineer who answered to Jervis and let the actual digging out to contractors. That is how a job this size got done in an age before heavy equipment. You did not have one army. You had dozens of small gangs strung out along the survey line, each one grinding through its own mile or two of the Hudson Valley at the same time, all of them holding to the single grade that Jervis had set. If any one of them cut too deep or not deep enough, the water would either pool or run backward, so the level had to be right in every gang's ditch, mile after mile, or it was right nowhere. Start with the channel itself. For most of its length, the aqueduct is not a pipe and not an open ditch. It is a masonry tunnel shaped like a horseshoe, 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide, big enough for a man to walk through upright with room to spare. The bottom is an inverted arch of brick, so the floor curves up at the sides. The sides slope outward and then close again into an arch across the top, and the whole shell is backed with stone and concrete so the water never touches raw earth. Jervis wanted the inside smooth and permanent, because the grade was so gentle that any rough patch would slow the flow and any leak would rot the hill it ran through. Tower, the assistant who wrote the book, watched crews lay that brick by hand, ring by ring, mile after mile, and he understood he was watching something that would either last a century or fail in a season depending on the care of the man holding the trowel. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. I want to stay on Tower for a moment, because he is the reason this video can exist at all. He was born in 1817, joined the Croton engineering staff in 1837, and stayed on it through the whole build. In 1843, a year after the water came, he published a volume he called Illustrations of the Croton Aqueduct. It was 21 plates of the work, drawn from the field, the arches and the tunnels, and the gatehouses rendered in careful detail, with the text to explain them. That is a rare thing to have. Most great works of that age come down to us as a finished monument and a pile of dry contracts. Tower gave us the aqueduct as the men on the line actually saw it going up, and when I tell you how a crossing was built or how a tunnel was cut, it is very often because one of his own engineers stopped, mid-construction, to draw it. Then there was the ground. The Hudson Valley is not a smooth ramp. It is ridges and stream valleys and outcrops of hard rock, and the aqueduct had to hold its 13-inch grade straight through all of it. Where the land rose, the crews had to cut down into it, and where it was solid rock, they had to blast. Remember what year this is. Dynamite did not exist yet. It would not be invented until 1867, a full generation later. So every foot of rock on this line was broken with black powder, the same volatile, unpredictable gunpowder that the firefighters had used to level buildings in the Great Fire. A man drilled the hole by hand with a hammer and a steel bar, packed the powder, lit it, and ran. Then the crews came back with picks and shovels and hauled the broken rock out by the basket and the barrow. Where the aqueduct ran underground, they sank shafts down to the line so the diggers could work the tunnel from inside and let the powder smoke escape. You can still find those stone ventilators standing along the route today, roughly one every mile, little stone chimneys in the woods, and about 21 of them survive along the trail. Plenty of hikers walk right past them, without ever knowing they are looking at the breathing holes of a hand-dug tunnel. Where the aqueduct met a stream valley too deep to cross on grade, Jervis threw a stone bridge across it and ran the water over the top. The finest of these still stands in the village of Ossining, and it is worth seeing. It is called the Double Arch. The great upper arch that carries the water is 88 feet long and 76 feet high, a single clean span of cut stone leaping the Sing Sing Kill, and it has held its shape and its water for more than a century and a half. Everything about it was cut and set by hand. There was no crane on that job that a modern builder would recognize. There were sheer legs and block and tackle and rope and mules and a great deal of human muscle, and the result is a bridge so sound that the village later ran a road under it, and it carries that too. Now I want to tell you about the night it almost all came apart, because the record of a great project is never a straight line of triumph, and this one nearly drowned in its own river. Everything on the line depended on the dam up at the Croton, the masonry weir that caught the river and fed the aqueduct. Part of that first dam was built up with an earthen embankment. In the first week of January, 1841, with the work years along and the end finally in sight, the weather turned. There was about 1.5 feet of snow on the frozen ground, and then, on the 5th, the temperature shot up and it began to rain, hard, for 3 days. The snow melted all at once. Every creek in Westchester filled and kept filling, and by the night of the 7th, the Croton was over its banks and climbing toward the top of the dam. At around 2 a.m. on January 8th, the water began pouring over the earthen part of the embankment. Within an hour that earth gave way. What came down the gorge was not a flood in the ordinary sense. It was a moving wall of water and broken ice and debris that reached, at the narrow points, a height of 50 feet. It tore out the Van Cortlandt Mills. It swept away every bridge and building on the banks of the lower Croton and carried them into the Hudson, and people died in it. Years of work, and the water supply of a city, undone in a single winter night by the very river they were trying to capture. Jervis and his engineers went back and rebuilt the dam in solid masonry, this time with a long curved face designed to break the force of the water sliding over it, and a pool at the bottom to catch and calm the fall. They had learned what the river could do, and they built the second dam to take that blow and hold. Setbacks like that fed the doubters, and there were many of them. This was the most expensive public work the city had ever attempted, and the bills kept climbing past every estimate anyone had put on paper. Douglas had once figured the whole line at under $5 million. It was plainly going to cost far more than that, and through the long middle years of the digging, there were respectable voices in New York, calling the whole thing a folly, a bottomless ditch that would drown the city in debt before it ever delivered a drop. Jervis had no answer for them, except the work itself. He could not argue the aqueduct into existence. He could only hold the grade, mile after mile, and trust that running water would settle the argument once it arrived. It did, but for 5 years he was building on faith and other men's money, with the critics reading the ledgers over his shoulder. That left the last and largest obstacle, and it was the one everyone could see coming. Between the aqueduct and the city lay the Harlem River, a wide tidal channel with ships moving on it. Jervis could have saved a fortune by dropping the water down into a pipe, running it across the riverbed under pressure, and letting it climb the far bank on the other side, a trick engineers call an inverted siphon. He drew that cheaper plan, but the state legislature, worried about blocking navigation on the river, ruled in the spring of 1839 that any crossing had to leave at least 100 feet of clearance for ships. So Jervis built up instead of a cross. He built High Bridge. High Bridge is 1,450 feet of cut stone marching across the Harlem River Valley on 15 great arches, and it originally carried the water about 140 feet above the river. The piers went down onto bedrock and onto oak piles driven deep into the river mud, and the arches went up one shaped stone at a time. Across the top, the bridge carried the Croton water in a pair of great iron pipes about 3 feet across, and years later, when the growing city needed still more, the engineers added a third pipe more than 7 feet wide to push the volume higher. It was so slow and so expensive that the aqueduct actually opened years before the bridge was finished. In 1842, to get water into the city on time, the crews ran it across the Harlem on a temporary low pipe while the great bridge was still rising beside them. The permanent high bridge did not open until May of 1848, and when it was done, it had cost the better part of $1 million all by itself. It was worth every stone. High Bridge is still standing today. It is the oldest bridge in New York City, older than the Brooklyn Bridge by 35 years, and you can walk across it right now. If you are new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. I have given you the engineers and the arches, and now I owe you the men who actually moved the earth, because Jervis did not dig this himself. The aqueduct was built by hand by a workforce of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 laborers, and the large majority of them were Irish immigrants, many of them fresh off the boat into a country that wanted their muscle and not much else. They did the drilling and the blasting and the hauling and the bricklaying, in all weather, along the whole open cut, for wages of about $1 a day. And I have to be honest with you about the record here. We know the wage, we know the count, we mostly do not know the names. The paymaster's books track the yards of rock moved and the dollars paid out, but the individual Irishmen who broke that rock are, for the most part, lost to the record. The ledger kept the labor and let go of the man. And it was dangerous work. Think about what a day on this line actually looked like. A man drilled a hole into solid rock by hand, one holding the steel bar and another swinging the hammer onto it, then packed it with loose black powder and lit a fuse he could only hope was cut to the right length. The record of a job like this, done with early gunpowder and no safety of any kind, is a record of premature blasts and falling rock and men crushed in the cuts. The crews lived rough alongside the work, in shanties strung out through the Westchester woods, moving their families down the line as the ditch advanced. Fever and the ordinary accidents of heavy labor took a steady toll that the paymaster never tallied the way he tallied the yardage. These were not soldiers in an army that counted its dead. They were day laborers, and the country that hired them did not think their names were worth writing down. We do know they did not take everything quietly. In 1840, the contractors tried to cut the daily pay from $1 down to 75 cents, and the workers walked off the job in a strike. The response was not a negotiation. The authorities called out the militia to break the strike and force the men back to the line. It is a hard, human detail, and it belongs in the story, because the clean water that saved the city was pulled out of the ground by people who were themselves treated as disposable. Jervis, for his part, ran a tight and sober work site. He was known for his exact specifications, and for discouraging liquor anywhere near the work, which on a line full of black powder was plain common sense, because drink and loose gunpowder in the same hands get men killed. The point I keep coming back to is that this was not machine work with a few men supervising. This was thousands of human backs bending for 5 years, turning a survey line into a stone river. And where was all that water going once it reached Manhattan? Jervis built 2 great reservoirs to hold it. The first, the receiving reservoir, sat up on high ground at a place called York Hill, and the crews blasted its basin down into solid rock. It was enormous, more than 1,800 feet on a side, and it could hold as much as 180 million gallons. If you know New York at all, you already know this spot, even if you do not know its history, because that reservoir was later drained and filled and turned into the Great Lawn in the middle of Central Park. The families spreading blankets on that grass are sitting in the bowl of the old Croton receiving reservoir. From York Hill, the water ran down to the distributing reservoir, and this one the whole city could visit. It stood at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, and it did not look like a water tank at all. It looked like a temple. Jervis and his architects faced it in massive granite walls 50 feet high and 25 feet thick, sloped like the pylons of an Egyptian tomb, holding 20 million gallons behind them on a 4-acre block. On top of those walls ran a public promenade, and it became one of the fashionable places in the city to walk. Edgar Allan Poe strolled that wall. New Yorkers went up there to take the air and look out over a city that finally had water. That reservoir is gone now, torn down at the end of the century, but you know its site too. The main branch of the New York Public Library, the one with the stone lions, stands where those Egyptian walls once held the Croton water, and a piece of the old foundation is still down in the library's south court. Before I bring the water into the city, I want you to sit with the precision of the thing for a second, because it is easy to say 41 miles and 13 inches to the mile and let the numbers slide past. Picture it instead. A drop that shallow over an entire mile is a fall you could not even see with your eye standing down in the channel. The floor looks flat to a man walking it, and they held that invisible slope, without a single laser or a powered instrument of any kind, across every mile of hills and swamps and river valleys, using a spirit level, a surveyor's transit, measuring rods and stakes driven into the ground by men who checked each other's figures by hand. Too much fall in one stretch, and the water would race and undercut the masonry. Too little, and it would sit and go stagnant and back up on itself. They got it right, the whole way, the first time, and the water walked itself down to the city on nothing but that grade. The distance is what ends up in the title. Holding that unseeable slope steady the entire way is the part that should stop you cold. So let me bring the water home the way it actually arrived. After the final inspections in June of 1842, they let the river in on the 22nd, and it made its 22-hour walk to the Harlem. It filled the receiving reservoir up at York Hill on the 27th. And then, on the 4th of July, of all days, the Croton water poured into the distributing reservoir on 42nd Street, and the city had its supply. New York being New York, it waited a few months and then threw itself the biggest party it had ever seen. On October 14, 1842, the city held a parade 7 miles long to celebrate the water, the biggest procession New York had ever staged. The fire companies marched, the trade societies marched, the temperance men marched behind the plain fact that this was clean water and not liquor, and President John Tyler came up for it. The members of the New York Sacred Music Society sang a specially written Croton ode in front of a new fountain in City Hall Park, and when they turned that fountain on, it threw a jet of Croton water 50 feet into the air over a crowd that had spent its whole life drinking from fouled wells. People toasted with something they called a Croton cocktail, which was river water and lemonade, and they meant it as a boast, because for the first time in living memory the proudest thing you could hand a New Yorker was a glass of plain water. The former mayor Philip Hone, who kept a famous diary, wrote that nothing was talked of or thought of in New York but Croton water. It had cost far more than anyone promised. Douglas had once estimated the whole line at under $5 million. By the time the pipes were laid and the interest was paid, the Croton system had run to something near $12.5 million, better than double the early guess, which is the oldest story in public works. But the city paid it and never looked back, because the alternative was another fire it could not put out and another summer of the cholera, and nobody wanted to live through either of those again. And the water changed the city almost overnight. Remember the frozen hoses of 1835, the firemen with nothing to pump. Now the streets filled up with hydrants fed straight off the Croton line, laid down at a rate of about 60 a week, and for the first time in its history, New York could actually throw water on a fire under real pressure. The receiving reservoir up at York Hill was taking in around 35 million gallons a day, and something like 134 miles of iron distribution pipe went in under the city streets to carry it to the wards. Running water, which had been a luxury of the very rich, began to reach ordinary homes. Indoor taps spread. Bathtubs, which had been a rare thing, started appearing in houses that had never had them, and the sewers followed the fresh water in. A city that had been drinking out of a fouled pond 3 years earlier was learning to live like a modern place, and all of it flowed from that shallow, unwavering grade, holding steady across the whole hand-laid line. Here is what I find almost hard to believe, standing in our own century. That hand-dug aqueduct did not just work for a year or a decade. It carried the drinking water of New York City for about 50 years, until a larger new Croton aqueduct was tunneled deeper to take over the growing city's thirst. And even then, the old line was not abandoned. Parts of it kept running into the middle of the 20th century. The last stretch was not shut down until 1955, which means the pick-and-shovel tunnel that Jervis and Tower and those unnamed Irish crews finished in 1842 was still delivering water when televisions were in living rooms and cars had tail fins. And most of the great stonework is still out there. High Bridge still leaps the Harlem, the oldest bridge in the city, and in the 1860s they even raised a stone water tower beside it and hung a walkway along it so people could stroll across the river on the aqueduct itself. The double arch still carries its span over the Sing Sing Kill in Ossining, with a village street running through the lower arch beneath it. The stone ventilators still stand in the woods along the old line, those little chimneys marking the buried tunnel. Most of the route is a state historic trail now, and you can walk it for miles, right down the grassy roof of the aqueduct, from the Croton Dam site, down through Westchester, and on toward the top of Manhattan. The old keepers' houses still stand along it. When you walk that trail, you are walking on the lid of the channel, a few feet above water, that engineers first turned loose more than a century and a half ago, and for much of the way there is nothing to tell you the tunnel is even there. That was the whole point of it. I have thought a lot about why this feat is so nearly forgotten while the Erie Canal is remembered, and I think it is because the Croton did its job too well. When you open a tap and it runs clean, you do not think about the man with the level setting that impossible grade, or the Irishman with the drill and the black powder, or the engineer who taught himself the whole trade with an axe on another ditch 200 miles away. You just drink. I will leave you with a claim to argue about in the comments. We tend to assume that a job this size, 41 miles of precision masonry across broken country, simply requires modern machines, that it could not have been done any other way. The old Croton Aqueduct is the standing proof that it could, and did, with hand tools and gravity and 5 years of human labor, and that the result would outlast the men who swore it was impossible. I think it is the most important thing New York ever built, and the least celebrated, and I would put the engineering judgment of Jervis, an axeman with no diploma, up against any water authority working today. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.